So our next session, as I'm sure you're all aware, we are very, very privileged to have Rebiya Kadeer here with us to speak. So just to give you some information, which I'm sure you don't need, because I think Rebiya does not need an introduction. Rebiya is, of course, a human rights leader and former businesswoman who was ranked the 7th wealthiest individual in the People's Republic of China in the mid-1990s. She established a multi-million-dollar trading company and a department store and worked to provide assistance and opportunities to disadvantaged Uyghurs, especially women and children. Rebiya initiated the 1,000 Mothers movement in December 1997 to empower Uyghur women to start their own business. She also, somehow in her spare time, served as a delegate to the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, as well as a delegate to the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995. Originally held up as a model of Uyghur success and philanthropy, she fell from the favour of the People's Republic of China government leaders after she began calling upon the government to change its hardline repressive policies against the Uyghurs and end discriminatory restrictions on their cultural and religious expression. In 1997, Rebiya was stripped of her membership in both the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and she was forbidden to travel abroad. She was arrested in 1999 on her way to meet with the US congressional delegation that was visiting East Turkestan to investigate the human rights situation there. She was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment in March 2000 following a secret trial. Forced to spend 2 years in solitary confinement, she witnessed brutal torture and abuse carried out on her fellow prisoners. Her case received wide international attention as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch publicised her case and aggressively pursued her freedom. In 2000, Human Rights Watch awarded Rebiya its highest human rights award, and in 2004, Norway's Rafto Foundation honoured her with the Rafto Award. On March 17, 2005, 3 days before an official visit to Beijing by US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, she was released from prison, ostensibly on medical grounds, and sent to the United States, where she was given refugee status. However, her children and other family members have frequently been persecuted by the PRC authorities in retaliation for her human rights advocacy. 2 of her sons are currently serving lengthy prison sentences, and their punishments are widely seen as retaliation for her human rights activism on behalf of the Uyghur people. Other family members have been detained, placed under house arrest, and otherwise harassed. She has, of course, actively campaigned for the human rights of Uyghur people since her arrival in the United States and is widely regarded as the spiritual mother of the Uyghur people. In September 2005, Rebiya founded the International Uyghur Human Rights and Democracy Foundation in Washington, D.C., which works to promote human rights for Uyghur women and children. In May 2006, she was elected to the presidency of the Uyghur American Association. And in November 2006, she was elected as president of the World Uyghur Congress, which represents the collective interests of the Uyghur diaspora. So I think you'll agree with me that we are very, very privileged to have Rebiya Kadeer join us today, and it's with great pleasure that I invite you to the stage.
Welcome.
Sorry, I don't speak English. Uygurca değil mi? Bugün düştün kildiğinle nait hayırlı olsun. Bugün muş sorun sizler bilen birlikte boğallığım için ben üzem nait vakti hesaplayayım.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so proud to be among you this afternoon. It's truly my honor to come and speak here today.
Ben bugün bütün Amnesty International'ın azaları bilen ve şularının hizmetçileri bilen ve şularının aktifleri bilen bir meydanda oldum. Çünkü ben turumdan çıkkanda birinci qitim öğrengen İngilizce sözüm Amnesty International degan sözdü.
It's a real joy for me to be with members of Amnesty International and the supporters of Amnesty International because when I first released from prison, the first English words I learned was Amnesty International.
Şunu öğrendim. Benim halkım bu demokratiya devletlerini hiç kadar bilmeydi. Lakin bu Amnesty 20 milyon Uyghur Amnesty degan gapni intayin bak yatlıvagan çünkü özünün anası bolgan bir adamның Amnesty degan isim bilen bağlanışlığını bek bildi.
And the Uyghur people, since my release, began to have a very profound understanding of Amnesty International. They believe that is an organization that helps them globally in spite of and other efforts by Western governments.
Ula rivayetide tikçar ayrıplan bilen düşüp, ayrıplanda Rebiya Hanım'ını turmudun kötürüp çıkarken bizim Amnesty kutuldurdu da oturdu o Birleşken Devletler Teşkilatı yan birisi kutuldurdu diyen acı bilip gitmeydi.
There has been a legend about my rescue operation by Amnesty International when I was in prison among the Uyghurs, widespread after I was released. The legend goes that Amnesty International sent a special rescue squad to the prison. Amnesty International rescued me from prison and took me to America. Then the Uyghurs... So that became so widespread among the Uyghurs, although that's not the fact.
Çünkü ben şu hakikaten Amnesty International bolmagan bolsa, men bugün sizlerning muş aldыңlarda tirik muşunda turup, sizler bilen yüzme-yüz oturup görüşüşüm mutlak yok gap desem bulattı.
So in fact, without Amnesty International's support and pressure on China and raising my case, I can say that I wouldn't be able to be standing before you and speaking to you.
Çünkü Xitay hükümetinin siyasetinde 62 yıldan beri Uygurlardan siyasi mahpuslarını tuncu qitim, birinci qitim ve belki ahir qitim bulup qilishi mümkün muşundak erkinlikке müddetten burun turmudun koyup etişi bir mucize.
Because my release is indeed a miracle, because that's the first time in Uyghur history that the Chinese government has released a Uyghur political prisoner, a prisoner of conscience before her term, his or her term. Maybe this is the last time that the Chinese government has done that.
Şunun için ben Amnesty International'ın ki bu azaları bilen her vakit birge bolgan vaqtimda özümning muş erkinligim bilen zich münasibetlik bolgan muş sepke ailem bilen aza bolup kirip ketdim.
That's why after my release from the dark Chinese prison, I became a strong supporter not only of Amnesty International, my entire family also joined Amnesty International.
Men misle bilen birlikte yalğız Uygurlarınla emas, bütün dünyadaki erkinlikке muhtaç bolgan barlık milletlerinin sizlerning sepinglarda turup, mana erkinlikni söygen adam berganligi uchun men onu qaytarib berishim kerak.
So I feel it's my duty and also honor to work with Amnesty International and with all the supporters of Amnesty International and the freedom-loving people around the world to promote human rights and freedom not only for the Uyghur people but for all oppressed around the world.
Rahmet, Amnesty aldı bilen Amnesty International'ның bugün 50 yıllığı ve muşu içiliş murasimini ötkezgen orunun isimlerini bilemeyme, ondan tebrikleyme.
So on the 50th birthday of Amnesty International, I would like to thank this great human rights organization, Amnesty International, for its 5 decades of efforts in pursuit of human rights and for inviting me, especially Amnesty Australia, for inviting me to come and speak here today.
Men Xitayning turmusu solanğa vaqtimda 2 yıl qaranğa bastırıqtı yattım.
When I was imprisoned by the Chinese government on bogus charges, I was solitarily confined in the first 2 years.
Bütün bedellerim eqip, hatta işip, midriyamaydigan halatda beşimni kötüremey kaldım.
My condition became so terrible that my whole body was swelled up and I couldn't even move my legs.
Meni aşının işide sesip ölüsen seni doktorga apamaymiz dedi.
I was told by my Chinese prison officials that you're gonna rot here and die here and don't expect to get out and be free.
Lekin tuyuqsuzluğun nurgun askerler güldürülüp kirip meni bir appak uyga ötkedi.
But suddenly one day some plainclothes soldiers, agents came into my cell and took me to a better cell for a reason I never understood initially.
Appak halat giygen doktorlar bedellerimni tekşirdi, düşüm oğlumu dep kaldım.
Then doctors in white robes came in and took care of my illnesses. I thought I was dreaming or what?
Men şu vaqtida şundaq bir anladım ki dünyadan nurgulluğan bir parça xatlar kelip sandıqlarning to'shib ketganligini.
Then I was able to learn from other prison guards that some letters of concern, the postcards came from all over the world regarding my condition. That sort of improved the treatment of the prison officials towards me.
Ana o sizlarning to'xtamay yozgan xatinglar.
That is the letters that you wrote raising my case there.
Meni turmadan aş qarangı öydən ölümdən qutuldurup yoruq öyga açıp doktor davalatqızdı.
So you saved me from this solitary confinement and really death. Then you were able to take me to a better cell with some care.
Men çıqqandan keyin şunu his qildim. Nurg'un Amnesty International'ның ki a'zolari hammasi aş to'xtamay xat yozadi ekan. Bu yozgan xatning natijasi qandaq balkim ular his qilolmaydigan bo'lishi mumkin.
After my release, I was able to learn that Amnesty International members all over the world, they sent postcards in to prison and to other Chinese officials expressing their profound concern of my condition. And then I was so deeply grateful of their actions, although most of those Amnesty members who wrote the cards may have never known the actual role they have played in getting me released.
Әді диктатор дөвләтләді му, ашы әр біріңлерінің yazgan bir parça xetinin toplashqa vaqtidagi kuchi әні ашу.
And my release indicates the strength of your patient work, and the postcards you sent have such tremendous effect on authoritarian regimes.
Şu vaqtida qandaqdır bir kuchning meni mush o'limdan qutuldirib aşağı ekivatqanligini his qildim. Gerçi Amnesty deb bilamasam-mu, shundaq bir kuchning bor ekanligini men his qilgan.
In prison, although I did not know that it was chiefly Amnesty International that was so concerned with my case, but I knew somebody, some organization was doing something miraculously.
Meni aq yoruq o'yga yetkiganda meni shu kundan tatib urush, tillash, qiynash, haqorat qilishlardan qutuldum.
Once I was removed from this dark cell, from the solitary confinement to the better, brighter cell, and since that day on, all this psychological, physical torture, abuse stopped.
Demek, ular dünyadaki bu adalet güçlü tüm korktu, bana qattiq besim işletip öldürüp etiştin.
Then there I realized that even extremely repressive, authoritarian country like China is afraid of the power of Amnesty International.
Yani şu Amnesty International.
That is Amnesty International.
Men hem de bugün özümün hayatımını dep berme, men turmada 6 yıl sözleş hukukudan, xat yazış hukukudan, xatırı qaldırış hukukudan, kitap okuş hukukudan, insanlara qarab kulish hukuku hammadan mahrum qalgan adam.
And during my 6-year imprisonment, I wasn't allowed by the Chinese authorities to read, to write, to speak, and even to look at and smile to a fellow inmate.
Xitay hükümeti meni 8 yıl kesti.
As you know, the Chinese authorities sentenced me to 8 years.
Lekin seni bu qora darvozadan hayat chiqarmaymiz deb o'zimga uqtirdi.
But I was told that you will never leave the dark prison alive.
Hatta ölüp ketsen ölügünmü muş darvozaning ichiga ko'miladi, biz dastlab yurimiz dedi.
And after you die, we're going to bury you right here and we're going to step onto your body every day.
Men hayran qalatdim, shundaq bo'lib ketishim mumkinmi deydim.
And I often wondered whether that was going to happen.
Meni baqqan turmidagi saqchilar seningdek nurg'ulliq adam ana shundaq bo'lgan, sening o'xshash odamning taqdiri shundaq tugaydi degan.
The prison guards often told me that there were many people like you before. Their destiny was all death and we killed them and you are not an exception.
Lekin osmondan meni ilqi tikuchar keliblam turmudan julibla undaq ochib ketmisimi? Xuddi shundan o'xshash chiqib ketdim.
Although later I wasn't rescued by an Amnesty squad with a helicopter, but I was sort of rescued like that.
Meni turmudikilarning o'zimi chiqib ketinimga ishonmay qoldi.
Even the prisoners and even the prison officials in that prison could not believe that I would be free.
Qor kiyim kiygan bir top odam kelibla mashinaga selib, sen ozod bo'lasan dedi. Sen ozod bo'lsanmi dedi, seni bir yerga opirimiz deblam olib chiqib meni meningden bir neçe xil va'dalarni oldi, siyosatga aralashmasligimni, u bularni dedi, shuning bilan meni Amerika elchixonasiga topshirib berdi.
One day, plainclothes Chinese agents in dark suits swarmed into the prison and my cell and took me. They said, we're going to take you to another place, but you need to promise certain things, such as if you leave the country, you are not get involved in human rights activism.
Bu möcüzəyə mənim xalqım heyran qaldı. Hongtang bütün Xitay dövlətidəki Xitay xalqı heyran qaldı. Hakimiyyət içindəki bir qism adamlar heyran qaldı.
And my release really sent shock waves among the Uyghurs and in addition to the Chinese prison officials, Chinese people themselves, and even some of the Chinese top-level officials in the central government.
Mən çıxqandan keyin Amnesty International'ның mənim xalqımı bütün dünyaya birinci qitim mənim xalqımның əhvalı Tibetning əhvalı bilan oxşaş. Bizni bir yıl burun besib aldı, Tibetni bir yıl keyin besib aldı. Tibetni mu Şizang Avtonom rayonu dep berdi, bizni Şinjan Uyghur Avtonom rayonu dep berdi. Bizning tatıyatqan günümüz, tariximiz, siyasi əhvalimiz, duch kelyatqan məselemiz oxşaş.
So I'm eternally grateful for Amnesty International and Amnesty's members in raising my case. And when you look at the Uyghurs, our situation, of course, is really terrible. You can compare to the case of Tibetans. And after Chinese occupation of us, China occupied Tibet a year later, in 1950. Then China granted so-called autonomous regions to both areas. But in fact, we share the same political destiny.
Lekin Holmes Dalai Lama Tibet meselesini bütün dünyaya anlatalıdı. Şundak 60 yıldan beri ölüp atkan, bastırılıp atkan, kırılıp atkan, şundak ağır ahvalıga duç kelgen Uyghur halkının avazını hiç kandak adam oxumadı.
Luckily, the Tibetans have His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who was able to flee Tibet and to raise the case of Tibetan persecution around the world. As a result, the international community has been quite aware of their situation. But in our cases, the Chinese government was able to successfully silence the voice of the entire Uyghur people.
Çünkü bizning liderimizni Holmes Dalai Lama keçip chiqib keteldi. Bizning liderimizni tinchlik suhbatiga chaqirib, Stalin bilan Mao Zedong bütün liderlerimizni aeroplan bilan portlatib o'ltirib atgan edi.
In the case of Tibet, His Holiness was able to flee. In the case of Uyghurs, Uyghur leadership was tricked by Stalin and Mao Zedong for a negotiation. Then they were all killed and state that they died of a plane crash of some sort. Then we were occupied.
Şuna menimki muşu xalqımның muş avazını anlatamagan bir xalqımni Amnesty International'da muşundak organ sizler meni qutuldurup çıkıp menin xalqımga bir avaz soğuk kıldыңlar.
So as a result of Amnesty's ceaseless efforts in raising my case and eventually securing my release, Amnesty International has in fact produced a voice for the Uyghur people globally.
99 yılı tuncu qitim Uyghur meselesinin Amnesty International 97 yılıki namayış vakasının dünyaya report kılıp Uyghur halkının dünyanın Uyghur halkının tunuşunun birinci perdesini açtı.
And it was Amnesty International that produced the first ever report on the situation of the Uyghur people in April 1999 with regard to the Gulja massacre which took place 2 years earlier.
Çünkü Gulca'da bizim yaşlarımız erkinlik, dini erkinlik, tinchlik ve söz erkinlik deb tinchlik bilan namoyishga chiqib Xitoy hukumati keng ko'lamda qattiq qonliq bostırgan edi.
Because in February 1997, when thousands of young Uyghurs took the streets peacefully to protest against Chinese repression, they were massacred by Chinese security forces for resisting against China's brutal rule in our country.
Neçe minliğen Uygurlar muşundak neçe qitim namayışlarda, tinchlik namayışlarda bastırılıp öldürülgen bolsumu dünya anlamagan, bilmegen, ana şu 97 yıllık vakani Amnesty dünyaga uqtirgandan keyin bizdeki meseleni dünya uqdi.
There had been many massacres before the massacre of 1997, but because of Amnesty's report, extensive report on the massacre in 1997, then the international community began to understand the real suffering of the Uyghurs and pay attention to the human rights abuses there.
Yani şu vaqtdan başlap bizning maslimizga dunyo ko'ngil bo'lishga boshladi.
After that, the international community began to pay more attention.
Mana men bugun ham sizlarning oldingizda turibdiman. Men o'zimning xalqimning qisqacha ahvolini tunishtirib ketaman.
And now I'd like to give you a little bit introduction on the Uyghur situation.
Uyg'urlar 1949 yılı besib elingandan keyin Xitoy hukumatı 55 yılı Uyg'urlarga yerlik millat bo'lganligi uchun Şinjan Uyghur Abdunum Rayon o'zinglarning taqdiringlarni o'zinglar belgilaysizlar degan huquqni berdi.
And the Chinese Communist troops occupied East Turkestan in 1949. 5 years later, the Chinese government conferred what is now the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, promising the Uyghurs self-rule in the region.
Endi şu vaqtda 2% Xitoy xalqi bizda qolgan 12% qarindosh millatlarimiz bizningki qolgan ko'chman millatlar batdi 86% Uyg'ur batdi.
At the time of occupation, we had only 2% Chinese population in our country. 86% are the Uyghurs, and the rest were other indigenous groups.
Endi bizningki ziminimiz Sharqi Turkiston deb atilib qilishdik sababmi? Biz O'rta Osiyo bilan Qozog'iston, Qirg'iziston, O'zbekistonlar bilan birlikda burun bir Turkiston deb jo'grafiyalik dunyoda atilib qolgan.
The reason our country is called East Turkestan is because historically there was one Turkestan, which include the western part of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. So that's why, after they became free and independent states, our name is still East Turkestan.
Endi G'arbiy Turkiston, Qozog'iston, Qirg'iziston, O'zbekiston, Rossiya tarafdan ishg'ol qilindi, bizningki Xitoy tarafdan ishg'ol qilindi. Shu vaqtda bizning ismimiz shundaq bo'lgancha, biz shundaq Sharq Turkiston atilib qoldik.
And historically, the Russians came occupied the western Turkestan. Today is Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and the Chinese came occupied us, the eastern part.
Endi hozir biz Xitoy hukumatining qo'liga besilgandan keyin Xinjiang Uyghur Abdunum Rayon deb atilamiz.
And after Chinese occupation, we became the purported Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
Bizning madaniyatimiz, urf-odatimiz, tilimiz Qozoq, Qirg'iz, O'zbek, Tatar xalqlar bilan o'xshash.
And our culture, language, traditions, and everything is closely related to the Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek peoples, and nothing to do with the Chinese.
Xitoy hukumati bizga avtonom qonunni bergandan keyin bizni o'z tilimizni, madaniyatimizni taraqqiy qildiradigan, o'z dinimiz bilan mangadigan, hatto ishlashdimi 86% hamma o'rinlarda Uyg'urlar o'zining imtiyoziga o'zi ega bo'ladigan nurg'un yaxshi qonunlarni, chiroyli qonunlarni bizga bergan. Biz shuning uchun Xitoy xalqi bilan inoq yaxshi mush qonunni ijro qiladi deb o'tgandik.
After the initial days of occupation, the Chinese government promised us a lot of things, in addition to self-rule, that respect of our culture, language, religion, and in terms of employment, the enjoying of the natural resources, all were granted to the Uyghur people. So the Uyghurs welcomed the Chinese settlers in the successive years.
Xitoy hukumati sizlarni manjudin, militarist Xitoylardan biz ozod qildik, sizlarni baxtli qilamiz degan edi.
Chinese communists promised that we came to liberate you from this initial Manchu occupation, then the Chinese nationalist occupation. We are the good guys, the liberators.
Lekin bizning o'zimizning 44-yil ozod qilgan mustaqil davlatimizdan ayirib bizni besib olgandan keyin ular besib olganda bizning milliy kimligimizga hargiz chiqilmagan, o'z taqdirimizni o'zimiz belgilagan xalq Xitoy kommunistlari besib olgandan keyin biz bir kunmi tinchlikka erishamadik.
Prior to the Chinese communist occupation, although we lost our state, but we were still able to control our own regions, use our language, culture, and practice religious beliefs. But after Chinese communist occupation, we have never enjoyed one day of peace.
Avval bizning xalqimizni namratlashtirdi. Yer, zimin, uylarini Bingtuandan kelgan ko'chman Xitoy xalqiga tortib bekaga olib berildi.
One of the first policies initiated by the Chinese was to take the land and properties of the Uyghurs and turn them over to the Chinese settlers, which formed the Xinjiang Construction Production Corps.
Undan keyin maharibsizlashtirdi.
The second is to leave the Uyghurs in ignorance, so destroy our education system.
Onundan keyin dinsizlaştırdı.
Then make us communists, atheists, and get rid of our religion.
Onundan keyin bütün ziyalilerimizni, okutkucularını, alimlarını, yazgıçılarını, bularını yo'qotmasak bo'lmaydi deb turmaga tashlab, o'ltirib, muddatsiz kesib tugatdi.
And initiated political campaigns and purges targeting Uyghur intellectuals who did not share with the Chinese government version of history.
Onundan keyin qilib qolgan odamlarni, onundan keyin qulning qatorida yovvoyilardek qilib, bütün axloqiy jihatdan, hamma jihatdan chekindirishga boshladi.
Then after their colonial rule, after they succeeded in this purges and campaigns, they left the Uyghurs in total ignorance who cannot defend their own rights. Then they say these Uyghurs are barbarians, they're backward, uneducated. We came to civilize them.
Uyghur xalqiga bergan qonunning bir nima ijro qilmadi.
Not a single promise made by the Chinese communists was in fact implemented.
Qonunni ijro qilish to'g'riliq so'zlagan bir oldingi qismdagi odamlarning hammasini milliy bo'lgunchi deb turmalarga tashlab, o'lim jazosiga hukm qildi.
For any Uyghur who demand the Chinese government to honor the promises made to the Uyghurs, and they were all arrested, imprisoned, many were executed.
Her 10 yılda bir qitim Uyg'urlarni qirg'an qirg'inchilikni boshqa bir ishkir o'lkadagi Xitoylardan birisiga shuning qildi, u qildi deb ishtirib, biz sizlarni ayt yaxshi kunga erishtiramiz deb her 10 yılda bir qitim qirg'inchilikdan keyin bizga va'da qildi.
And in addition to that, every 5-10 years, the Chinese government carried out political purges in our country, began to arrest and execute so many Uyghurs. Then the central government blamed that particular governor, said that was his mistake, and we're going to rectify, we're going to do well. They sent another brutal murderer to rule our region.
Lekin Uyg'urlarning milliy kimligini, tilini ve muşundak millet tüsünü yok kılamadı.
But unfortunately, the Chinese government was not successful in eradicating our religious beliefs, our language, and culture.
Xitay hükümeti davamlılık en cahil millet Tibet bilen Uyghur deydi.
For the Chinese government, the worst two groups in China are the Uyghurs and Tibetans.
Sizlerge bu yaxşılık ekenmeydi deyip durdu.
And they say, we try to help you, but you try to keep your own way of life.
Biz fakat özümüzün milli kimligimiz bilen kapkalımız dedik. Hiç kandak cahil hükümetki karşı hareket kılmadık.
We were not trying to resist anything. It's just that we want to be who we are, remain ourselves, not Chinese.
Lekin dünya terörizm hareketi meydana çıkkandan keyin Xitaylarning Uyg'urlarni mutlaq yo'qotish fırsatı keldi.
But after 9/11, the terrible terrorist attacks, and after the initiation of the global war on terror, China saw that a golden opportunity to justify the otherwise unjustifiable heavy-handed repression in the entire East Turkestan.
Çünkü biz Müslümankemiz.
After 9/11, we happened to be Muslims, so it became a good excuse for China.
Hadigelli bütün dünyaya Uyghur terörizmlarının tehdidiga duch keldik deb lan vaqirdi.
And overnight, China claims itself a victim of Uyghur terrorism. China faced the global terrorist threat. Then after that, began to murder all Uyghurs who refused Chinese rule.
Şarkı Türkistan'da hiç kandak terörizm hareket bo'lgan emas.
And Uyghurs have not been terrorists in East Turkestan.
Mushuni Xitoy hukumati o'zimi biladi, Xitoy xalqimi biladi.
Both the Chinese government and the Chinese people understand that full well.
Lekin Xitoy hukumati shu fursatdan foydalanib, tarixda 50 yildan beri ijro qilinmagan 10 siyosatni o'ttirg'a qo'ydi.
But after 9/11, the Chinese government using the global war on terror to justify a number of extremely cruel and inhuman policies that could not be justified prior to 9/11.
Birinchi Uyg'urlarning qizini Xitoy o'lkasiga yo'tkab ketish degan siyosatni oshkora o'ttirib qo'ydi.
One of the policies was to forcibly relocate, transfer young unmarried Uyghur women into Eastern Chinese sweatshops to work as basically slave labor.
Burun bunda qılanmaydı.
The Chinese government could not have done that prior to 9/11.
Onun üstüge 14 yaşdan 25 yaşgacha to'y qilmagan qizlar bo'lish kerak degan shartni qo'shib qo'ydi.
Interestingly, the condition was these women had to be anywhere from 14 to 25, unmarried.
Bunun kiydirilgan qalpoq ularga ish o'rni bilan ta'minlaymiz dedi.
The excuse is we are going to provide jobs to these unmarried, beautiful young women.
Şarkı Türkistan'da işçik bizde neft, gaz, grol, altın, göher, paxta, hem yer astı yer üstü baylıqımız. Bizge chattin ekegen Xitaylarını, milyonlagan Xitaylarını işqe orlaştırıp atqan, elbette özümüzдің kızları özümüzдің vətəndə işqe düşələydi.
In fact, there are tens of thousands of jobs available locally because of the huge natural reserves we have, whether oil, natural gas, gold, or anything, and also the agricultural fields. But instead of providing those jobs to these Uyghurs, they give these jobs, all the power privilege given to the Chinese settlers.
Bunun üstüge Uyghur halkı dixançılık, çarvıçılık, bağmançılıkını bək yaxşı gördü. Özü kimi öz iş tapalaydı.
And Uyghurs have been very good at farming, animal husbandry, and in growing fruits, etc. Even without Chinese government forcing them to go to Eastern China, they could find jobs themselves.
Minglaça, on minglaça kızlarını çiqir tutturup öydün dixanlarının öydün poyuzu besip ep getdi.
And the Chinese government forced tens of thousands of these unmarried young women from rural families and put them on trains, load them on the trains, and ship them to Eastern China, a hostile territory for them.
Kızlarını bəmigenlerini, qarşı çıqqanlarının həmmisini terrorizm dep turmağa saldı.
For those parents who were unwilling to give their daughters to the Chinese authorities, they were arrested, imprisoned, and even sentenced as a terrorist.
Bu siyaset 2005 yıldan başlap izchil icra kılındı.
Since 2005, this policy has been in place.
2001 yıldan başlap Uyghur tili ve Uyghur yazığı çeklendi.
A few years prior to that, in 2001, the Chinese government officially banned the use of the Uyghur language from all sphere of life.
Onun ismini qo'sh tillik ma'arif deb chiroyli qo'ydi. Amaliyotda Uyg'ur xalqi qo'sh tillik emas, uch tillik ma'arif qilib ko'nadi. Lekin ashundaq yolg'on qalpoq bilan Uyg'ur xalqining tilini ma'arifdan, maktablardan butunlay qo'g'lab chiqarib, o'qituvchi professorlarning hammasining o'rniga Xitoy o'qituvchilarini eklib, ularni darvoza boqadigan qilib qo'ydi.
And since 2001, the Chinese government initiated what they call bilingual policy. Bilingual means two equal languages, but that's really monolingual Chinese language policy. Uyghurs welcome to learn 2 or 3 languages, but the Chinese state's intent is to remove and replace the Uyghur language and eventually eliminate the Uyghur language. And as a result, the authorities basically forcibly removed all Uyghur teachers and professors who cannot teach their subjects in the Chinese language and force them out of schools and do like menial janitorial works.
Yeşi 45 yaşqa barabamıga o'qituvchilarning hammasini pensiyaga chiqishga majburladi.
And forced Uyghur teachers and professors who are not even 45 to retire from their jobs and give their jobs given to the Chinese from mainland China.
Yo'q deganlarni davlat siyosatiga qarshi chiqqan milliy bo'lgunchi deb turmaga tashladi.
For the teachers and professors who oppose this policy, again, it says against government policy, they were locked up.
Uningdiki dixanlar davlatning buyurgan narsasini teriydi, buyurmagan narsasini terimaydi deb dixanlarni qalanda qilyapti.
And also the government forced the Uyghur farmers to grow only certain kind of crops that the government wants for profit, and they did not allow the farmers who used to farm whatever they wanted to farm. Then as a result, a lot of these Uyghur farmers became bankrupt, lost their lands and everything to the Chinese settlers.
Endi dixanlarni majburiy Xitoy o'lkalariga yo'tkilib, sen azan qul bo'lasan, sening yeringni Xitoy ko'chmanlari kelib, terishni o'gitib qo'ydi, sizlar yer terishni bilmaydi ekansizlar. Bu siyosatni oshkora, chunki bizda 86% Uyg'urlar dixan. Dixanchilik bizning bir kasbimiz. Shu yerdan ayirib Xitoy o'lkalariga tarqaqlashtirdi.
Then after the Uyghur farmers lost their lands, lost their means of subsistence, then the Chinese government forced them to leave their lands and go to mainland China to make a living in those areas. And basically their lands were all divided and given to Chinese settlers to farm. And they became the owners of the land that once enjoyed by the Uyghur farmers.
Endi bunun qarshi chiqqanlarni turkumlab turmaga tashlandi.
And again, any farmer who opposed such policy is immediately arrested and sentenced for under all kinds of charges.
Xalqning hech chidash taqati qolmadi.
So the repression is so severe that for the Uyghurs it became unbearable.
Hayatında chetga chiqishni xohlamaydigan Uyghur xalqida mundaq bir naql bor. Kishining jutig'i chiqib sulton bo'lguncha o'zingning jutingda ulton bo'l deydigan. Faqat chetga mushu g'arb dunyosiga 20 yilning oldida chiqdi Uyg'urlar. Chiqmaydigan, chetga ketishga boshladi.
As a result, Uyghurs faced with such severe persecution had no choice but to flee our homeland. In Uyghur tradition, Uyghur people do not have a tradition of leaving the country for another country, and so they had no choice. So the Uyghurs are actually appearing in the Western countries in the past 20 years.
Şunun bilan Uyg'urlarning bütün chetga chiqish huquqini mahrum qilib, pasportini tatib olib, Uyg'urlarning chetga chiqish huquqini oshkora siyosat bilan chekladi.
Perceiving the Uyghurs who flee the country, go to overseas, as a threat to the Chinese government, the Chinese government basically confiscate the passports universally of all Uyghurs, prevent them from leaving the country.
Sharqiy Turkistonda ishga o'rinlashtirish o'rinlarida Uyg'ur oliy maktab bitkizgan o'quvchilari o'zini ishga tizimlatib kirmasin, olmaymiz degan narsalar oshkora yezilib qo'yildi.
Today, if you visit our country, you would see signs for employment. They say Uyghurs need not apply. We only want the Chinese. It's everywhere.
Milyon ko'chmanlarni akib Sharqiy Turkistonga to'kib, butun ekologiyani buzib tashlabdi.
And in the last 6 decades, the Chinese government transferred millions of Chinese settlers into our region to dominate the region, to substantially destroy our basically ecology, as you can see from the nuclear tests.
Hozir yerli xalq bilan 50% 50% qilib qo'ydi.
Right now, the population ratio is around half and half, 50-50.
Endi Uyg'urlar faqatla mushundaq deyish huquqi bor. Biz eng baxtlik, eng yaxshi yashayapmiz. Jungo Kommunistlik partiyasi bo'lmasa, biz odam bo'lmaydik degan gapdan boshqa gapni qilgan odam turma qilinadi.
Today, the only choice for Uyghur to live a normal life to say, we thank the Chinese Communist Party. Without the Chinese Communist Party, we wouldn't be enjoying these happy lives. And we thank the Chinese people for coming here, for helping us. If they say anything other than that, they would be in prison.
Butunlay Uyg'urlar yolg'on gap qilishga majburlandi.
And in order to survive, they have to lie.
Siz qandaq chet ellik bo'lishdan qat'iy nazar berib, bir Uyg'urdan ko'chadan so'rab, sen qandaq yashayapsan desangiz, eng baxtlik deydi.
So if you ever visit our country, ask just a random Uyghur, how are you living? He would say we're the happiest people under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party.
Uyg'ur og'zida so'zlayolmaydi.
The Uyghurs do not dare to say what is in their hearts.
Faqat uning ikki ko'zi so'zlaydi.
You can only see their eyes talking.
U sizga tikilib qaraganda u bir nimalarni ko'zida deb yig'laydi.
So when you look into their eyes, you would know what they are saying is not true.
Bütün Uyg'urlar naqshi bilan o'zini ifodalaydigan bo'lib ketgan.
So the only way for the Uyghurs to express their frustration is through songs and music.
Endi hozir shoirlarni naqshchilarni tutish siyosati chiqarildi.
Then obviously the Chinese government target those writers, songwriters, and singers.
Hammasi so'landi. Mana Uyg'urlarning taqdiri mushundaq oyoqlashyapti.
So that is a fate of the Uyghur people under the glorious rule of China.
Lekin Xitoy hukumatı yalnız Uyg'urlarla emas, Tibet, Xitoy xalqini mushundaq, o'zining xalqini mushundaq kishilik huquqda dafsanda qilyapti.
Obviously, the Chinese government wasn't only targeting the Uyghurs, same in Tibet, the Tibetans, and their own Chinese people also face tremendous human rights abuses.
Masalan, Tiananmen vaqasini ko'rdinglar. Xitoy xalqimi erkinlik talab qilgan Xitoy xalqimi o'xshashli turmuga tashlanadi.
It's the same for the Chinese people who demand freedom and democracy, as you can see in the Tiananmen massacre in 1989.
Masalan, Falun Gong deyli, Falun Gong degan o'zining diniy e'tiqod uchun minglagan, o'n minglagan Falun Gonglar hozir turmida.
And also for the Falun Gong members, they simply want to practice breathing without the authorization of the government, and they were persecuted so badly, and the tens of thousands of them are in Chinese prisons.
Lekin bizning endi eng ig'ir bo'lishi milliy to'qinish bo'lganligi uchun eng ig'ir.
But our case is worse because of Chinese government's fear that eventually they will lose that territory because of their repression.
Endi Uyg'urlarninki masalan yaqinda Qashqarni chaqdi. Bizning o'zimizning tilimizni, o'zimizni, hamma nimamizni yo'qitib, to'xtab qolmasdan bizning necha ming yil tarixga ega. Biz Budda dini, Shaman dini, yana birdan mushtaq dinlarga kirgan. Mushu Qashqarga butun dinning madaniyati bir umumlashgan bir shahar, dunyo g'azinasidagi bir madaniyatning markazini chiqib tashladi.
And as if banning our language, destroying our identity, and as a people not enough, the Chinese government began to demolish, really destroy the ancient Uyghur city of Kashgar for the past couple of years. Kashgar has some more than 3,000 years of history. And when the Uyghurs were shamans, were Buddhist, and were Manichaeist and Nestorian Christians, and later became Muslims, they all lived in that city. But the Chinese government is basically wiping out that city and destroying, forever eliminating our living organic history.
Bütün dünya bununla karşı çıktı, lakin Xitay parva qilmadi.
The international community protests against such destruction, but China is carrying out its destruction.
Hazır Xitay devleti boyunca ölüm cezası hüküm qilishda eng yuqori pallada turadigan Uyg'urlar.
And today, China's political executions are directly targeted against Uyghurs. Only Uyghurs are executed exclusively for political, non-violent offenses.
Ölüm cezası hüküm qılatqanlar bütünlay kichik balalar.
And most of the executed Uyghurs are kind of teenagers in their late teens and early 20s.
Her qitim sahnege açıqqa vaqtida 35-40 kichik yaş balalarni tizib açqib, aldığı 5'ke 10'ga ölüm cezası qilib, qolganlarga muddatli qamoq cezası hüküm qiladi.
If you follow the news every time you watch their public sentencing, you would see 20-30 Uyghurs standing there. Most of them are young kids, and 5 to 10 were sentenced to death. Rest of them were given life or 10-15 years in prison.
O kesilganlarning mu hayat qaytib chiqadigan intayin az.
And even those who were sentenced to prison terms, they can barely come out of prison alive because of torture.
Mana mushu masalalarni Amnesty International report qilib, masalan bizning 7 ayning 5 bo'lgandimi dunyo terrorizm masalasidagi report qilib Amnesty International dunyoga e'lon qildi.
And Amnesty, of course, is aware of the situations and has published several really important reports, one of which is on China's use of global war on terrorism as a pretext to justify the persecution of Uyghurs, and another is on the Urumqi massacre that took place 2 years ago.
Çünkü Xitay yoğunap ketdi. Xitay hamma tashviqotni qila oladi, hamma yolg'onni deya oladi. Biz dunyoga o'zimizni qanday tushuntirishimizni bilmaymiz.
And as you know, China is a rising power now. China has all the muscles and the money to tell their version of the story about us and to demonize us. And we are in a position of weakness, of course. It's very difficult for us to tell our story and to convince and win the hearts of the international community.
Mana mushundaq paytda Amnesty International Sharq Turkistonga adam avatib ishki tashqi tekshirishni naytı paklik narsalar bilan terrorizmdan foydalanib Xitoyning Uyg'ur xalqini bostirib atganligini dunyoga e'lon qilgandan keyin Yevropa parlamenti, Amerika Kongressi, senatori, bütün g'arb davlatlari bizning ahvolimizni qaytadan qarashga boshladi.
And at a historical juncture like this, Amnesty International produced a war on terror report, how China was abusing that rhetoric to persecute the Uyghurs. Then, whether it was at the US Congress and the European Parliament, they all had a very deep interest in the case of Uyghurs. Then they realized, China was not fighting some terrorists. They were killing innocent Uyghurs.
Biz mana mushundaq Amnesty International'ның yardımı bilan bizga o'xshash ovoz yo'q. Masalan, Amnesty International Aung San Suu Kyi deyli, uni turmudan qo'yib berdi, meni turmudan qo'yib berdi. Biz xalqimizga ovoz bo'ldik. Dunyoga chiqib munda davatimiz mushlarning hammasi mana mush o'tdagan Amnesty International sizlardek buyuk, sizlardek faxrlanarlik odamlarning kuchi.
So I personally cannot thank enough the importance, the hard work of Amnesty International in the past 5 decades, whether in pressuring the Chinese government to release me or the Burmese government to release Madam Aung San Suu Kyi or other, whether prominent or non-prominent prisoners of conscience globally. And so So the work you do are amazing, and you have made so much change. And a lot of oppressed peoples like us dependent upon you to raise our voice and be heard in the world.
Менің 11 балам бар.
I have 11 children.
5 балам Америкада,
5 of them in the US,
5 балам Шарқы Түркістанда,
5 of them in East Turkestan.
1 балам Австралияда.
One of them is actually in Australia.
Менің 5 балам тұрмыдан шыққыдыға вақтыда Қытай үкіметі, әгер Uyghur мәселесini дүнияға аңлатыдыған болсаң, biz senin 5 balаңны və iqtisadыңны özəң təsəvvür qılğandan artıq közəngə kökütüb qoyumuz degan idi.
Just prior to my release to the US, the top-level Chinese officials warned me personally, saying if you ever raise anything about the Uyghur situation, talk about human rights or freedom, once you are in the US and overseas, you know what we can do to your family members here and your business empire. We're going to destroy that more than you could ever imagine.
Meni aqlliq bol, şundaq iqtisadың bilan baxtlik nəticəliyə gələdi sodu qısan, biz sana yol içib berimiz degan idi.
I was told be smart, don't kid around. If you want to make your money, go make your money, but don't raise the situation of your people.
Mən ballarımı qaradım, xalqımı qaradım.
So once I was overseas, I had to look at my people's situation and my family situation.
9 nəvrəmimi qaradım.
I also looked at my 9 grandchildren in Chinese hands.
Çünki turmuda mən həmmə həqiqətini görüb çıxdım.
But in prison, I was able to learn the real nature of the brutality of the Chinese rule.
Xuddi mən Amnesty International'dək bir kişilik orunun avazıға muhtaç olğandək, xalqımı muşundaq bir adamның avazıға muhtaç ekan.
In the US, I realized just as I needed the support of Amnesty International while I was in prison, my people who are living in the open prison also needed a voice like mine.
Şunun bilan gerçi özüm qeyri ayal bolsammı, mən muş xalqımның avazı buluşunu tanlab aldım.
So although I'm an old woman, but I decided to choose to become the voice of my people.
Mən xalqımны dünyaya düşəndirişim kerak. Mening xalqım radikalizm emas. İslam diniga etiqad qiladi. Xuddi menga o'xshash bir shundaq erkin, san'at xumor, mehmon do'st, oq ko'ngil, yavaş bir xalq.
I need to explain who the Uyghur people are to the world in spite of Chinese demonization. And I need to explain to the world that Uyghurs are just like me. We are not terrorists or radicals or extremists as described by the Chinese government. We're peace-loving, friendly, hospitable, and who love music and the songs of peaceful people.
Mən və mening xalqım hər qandaq zoravallıqqa qarşı durumuz.
My people and I are opposed to any kind of violence.
Biz 62 yıldan beri zoravallıqның, terrorizmның dərdini bək tatdıq.
For the past 62 years under Chinese rule, all we suffered is violence and state terrorism.
Şunun üçün mən xalqımı dünyaya düşəndiriş üçün muşundaq olub, həxir mening balamni, 5 balamni bıraq turmuğa aldı.
And because of me speaking out against Chinese injustices, the Chinese authorities then target my 5 children in their hands.
Yani muş Amnesty International, Amerika hükümeti, yani Avrupa parlamentleri hembisi arlaşqandan keyin mening 3 balamni və nəvirlərimni nazarat astığı ilib 2 balamni 9 yıl 7 yıl kəsdi.
And after the involvement of Amnesty International, US Congress and European Parliament, the Chinese authorities released 3 of them, but sentenced 2 of them to lengthy prison terms, and the rest of them were, including my grandchildren, under house arrest.
Lekin mening 2 balamni odatdagi turmudan yaqinda 5 oyda bizning heytimiz kelganda menga uqtirib, odatdagi turmudan qiynash turmusiga yo'tkaganligini uqtirdi.
And just past May, I was informed that my 2 kids in prison, they were transferred from the normal prison to another notorious maximum security prison, possibly for torture.
O turmunun qandaqligini men bilaman.
I know what kind of prison that is.
Onu көз алдыма keltirishni xolamayman.
I don't want to imagine that.
Sizlarning yurkinglarni og'irtib so'zlab bergim yo'q.
And I don't want to talk about that prison to you either.
Bütün dünyada sizlarning kuchinglarga, sizlarga va bizga mushundaq muhtoj millatlar oz emas.
So it's not only the Uyghurs who suffer at the hands of Chinese, and there are a lot of people who are persecuted. They need your support.
Biz sizler bilen birlikte mana aşu ezilgen milletlerinin avazı bulumuz hem kelgüsüdür şularının erkinliği için kuraş kılımız.
So I want to become the voice of all oppressed, in addition with working with Amnesty International to help all the suffering.
Hazır Uygurlarının Dünya Uygur Kurultayı deydiğen Uygurlarga vekillik bir teşkilatı var.
At the moment, we have a global representative organization for the Uyghurs called the World Uyghur Congress.
Yani şu teşkilat bütün vatandın keçip çıkan barlık ziyaliler bilen ve inkılapçılar bilen bir yere toplaşıp Uygurlarının vekillik hizmetini işlevatımız.
So World Uyghur Congress is helping the Uyghurs who fled Chinese persecution and working with the Uyghur diaspora overseas.
Amerika'nın en iyi diyen orun bizge iktisadi cihetten yardım kıldı.
And thankfully, we get our funding from the National Endowment for Democracy in the U.S. for our peaceful human rights activism.
Dünya boyunca 51 devlet teşkilatımız var. Bunların hepsi Dünya Uygur Kurultayı'nın küllük astıda.
We have some 51 organizations around the world. They all work under the umbrella of the World Uyghur Congress.
Biz Xitay hükümetiga biz tinchlik bilan bir suhbat o'tkazib, Tibet bilanmi, Holnos Dalay Lama bilanmi o'tkazyapsan va garchi ijro qilmay aldab kelayotgan bo'lsangmi, ya'ni biz bilanmi suhbat o'tkaz, biz Sharq Turkistonda, Xinjiang Uyg'ur avtonom rayonida tinchlik o'rnatadigan bir tadbir ochqayli deb taklif qo'ydik.
And so the World Uyghur Congress and we have been calling for the Chinese government to initiate a peaceful dialogue for the final settlement of East Turkestan issue, just like the Chinese government had the dialogue with the Tibetans, although the Chinese government has not been that honest, but rather deceiving them. But our hope is to have a genuine discussion and a resolution.
Bu bütün dünyaya Rebiya Kadeer terörist bilen bir üstelge kemeymen dedi.
However, the Chinese government accused me as a terrorist and would never negotiate with me.
Endi mening Xitayni tillığını emas, Xitay hükümeti özü bütün dünyadaki teröristlerge yardım kılatıdı.
Yes, in fact, if you look at the Chinese government, it's the Chinese government that supports all these terrorist rogue states or the states that support terrorism globally.
Endi hazır mening xalqim 7 ayning 5i namoyishga chiqqan tinchlik bilan namoyishga chiqqan xalqimni qanday qirg'inchilik qilgandan hammanglarning xabari bor.
And but as you may know, what happened on July the 5th of 2009, when the young Uyghurs took the streets peacefully, they were massacred by Chinese security forces. Then they were blamed for terrorism.
Ahırda bir unutib qalgan bir gepimni deb qo'yaman.
I'd like to state one last point.
Xitay hükümeti 60 yıldan beri her kandak bir bayramını ötküzüştün burun, her kandak şehirde 5'ten 4'ten Uygurlarga ölüm cezası hüküm kılıp özünün en güzel bayramlarını ötküzüdü.
And it's a tradition for the Chinese communists to execute anywhere from 5 to 10 Uyghurs in every Uyghur town prior to China's national holidays, Chinese New Year or anything, to send a message to the Uyghurs. That's what happens to them if they do anything.
Bununla Xitay halkı mı karşı?
And of course, the peace-loving Chinese people are also opposed to such evil practices.
Lekin mening gepim ayaqlaştı. Hemminglarga qaytib bargandan keyin baxit, xotirjamlik tilayman. Ham sizlar bilan birlikda bir safda turib ishlayman.
And that's all I have to say. And I would like to ask God to bless each and every one of you, peace and joy and happiness to your families. And I will continue to work each and every one of you until we all have freedom to enjoy.
Sözləydiğin gepim bəhçiq, yığlab sözlüğüm baslayı.
I can speak for hours, but I'll stop here.
So Rebiya is very happy to answer some questions. I would ask you to speak slowly and maybe pause to give Alim a chance to translate as you go. So do we have any questions? We've got we don't have roving mics, I don't think. Do we? Yes, we do. have any questions? Kate, up the front here.
I'm Kate Weldrake. I'm on the board of Amnesty International Australia. Do you have any hope that the change of Chinese leadership will have any impact on human rights situation for the Uyghur people?
Mening ismim Kate dedi. Men Australia Amnesty International heyet azasının biri dedi. Hem de Xitoyda hozir bularning yangi rahbarlik o'zgaraydi dedi, kelajakda dedi. Shuningga bu yangi rahbarlikning chiqishi bilan kishilik huquq masalasida bir yaxshilanish bo'lamdi dedi.
Çünki bununla benim gözüm yetmeydi. Ümit kılma şundak buluştu. Bırak bu yana şu Hujunto'nun, Winjabo'nun özünün məxsus tərbiyələyən adamı çıxıvadı. Şunlaşqa benim bununla gözüm yetmeydi. Fakat Xitayının şundak özgürüş için Xitay xalqı özgürüş çıxırış gerek.
I certainly hope there will be positive changes, but I cannot see that because I see the upcoming Chinese president is going to be a protege of Hu Jintao or Wen Jiabo. It's the same succession, so it's hard to have hope. But my hope is in the Chinese people who can eventually change China, not in the leadership. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, just Cassandra.
Hello, Cassandra Devine, Amnesty activist. Thank you so much for your inspirational speech. I think everyone here is really inspired by it. And I was wondering what inspired you as a successful businesswoman. Was there a particular event or time that made you decide that you didn't want to stand by anymore? Was there something that happened to you that made you decide you had to stand up even if it meant losing everything?
Yeah, men ismim Cassandra dedi. Men Amnesty International aktivist dedi. Anakin rahmat sizdan so'zlagan so'zingizga. Dedi, mening deydiganim bo'lsa, siz ilgari nihoyatda cho'ng sodlar bilan aralashib, danliq shu korxonchi bo'libsiz. Lekin endi qachon ham nima sababdan siz endi qarab turmay, endi men bunga aralashib buni o'zgartmasam bo'lmaydi-ku xalqimning taqdirini qanchalik badal to'lashdan qat'iy nazar deb shu yakunga keldingiz.
97-yilgacha men parlament a'zosi haqiqatan sodi qilyotdim.
I was a member of China's parliament and a businesswoman until 1997.
Men iki karar memleketlik 5 yılın iki karar sayılınıp 10 yıllık parlamentte tuttum.
I was sort of elected twice as a China's national member of the parliament there.
Men Xitay hükümetiga nəhayət yaxşı xizmət qilib, tinchlik bilan Uyghur xalqini Xitay xalqı bilan barabarlik erişdirmen deb oyladım.
At the time, my hope was to work within the Chinese system, with the Chinese leaders, to change the political situation on the ground, and also to have a better relationship, create better conditions between the Han Chinese and the Uyghurs.
Xalqımni beyitib, muarifni yükseldirmen deb oyladım.
I was hoping to help the Uyghurs to prosper and to get better education.
Bikaga nurgulluğan İngiliz til, her xil tillik mekteplerini açtım.
I was also able to open up a lot of foreign language classes like English, etc.
Ve onun sırtıda 1000 ana şirketini kurup ayallarını soğuduğu yetekledim.
I also established the Thousand Mothers movement to help empower Uyghur women at the time.
Tırışçallıklarımın hemmesi bekak etti.
Everything I did became none.
Katı tosalga uçurdum.
Because I faced tremendous difficulty.
Şundak vakitte İlida xalq tinchlik bilan yoshlar namoyishga chiqdi.
Around that time, the Uyghur youth, young people in the city of Wolja peacefully protest.
Namoyishga chiqqanlarni saqchilar o'zi suv chechibmi to'xtatib olalaydi.
And in fact, the Chinese security forces could just spray water and scatter the Uyghurs from protest. It was easy.
Aeroplan bilan branuk bilan askar yetkab keldi, urush qildigandek.
But the Chinese government deployed standing armies to quell them, using tanks even, and the Chinese fully armed Chinese military.
Ko'chada namoyish qiluvchilar, namoyishga qatnashmay ko'chada ketib qolgan odamlarning qini oqdi.
It's not only the protesters who were killed, even the bystanders who happened to be on the same street were killed by the Chinese.
Yüzlegen iştila kichik balalarni talab etdi.
And hundreds of little kids were even killed and mauled by like military dogs and all.
Namoyishdan keyin namoyishga chiqqan odamdan 10 hassa ortiq odam turmaga tashlandi.
Then we believe maybe 10 times more people on the street were arrested and imprisoned by the
Şu vaqtda
Chinese.
Xitoy bizni bu to'polonchilarni bostirish to'g'ri deb so'zlanglar deb ochdi.
At that time, the Chinese government forced officials like me to speak out against the protest say they are the rebels.
Abdunum rayonunun Qorçaq Uyghur rəhbərləri öltəgən ölüstürüş kerak bular şu toğru bular xata qılğan dep xalqqa töhmət çapladı.
And the puppet Uyghur leaders in autonomous region, they all, toe the government line and condemn the Uyghur protesters, say they were the rebels, they tried to create disturbance in our country.
Hiç kim bu adalatsız ölümge toğru bir baha bəmidi.
And nobody gave a correct judgment to what happened there.
Tömüngdün artıq parlament əzaları qatnaşqan Beijingdeki jığında bu məsələni oturup qoydum.
Then I couldn't take it anymore. I raised the issue at Beijing's parliamentary session among some 4,000 members.
Uyghur parlament əzaları qoqup ketib tamaq vaxtında mening üstülümge kəlmidi.
And after that, the Uyghur members of parliament, they didn't even dare to have lunch with me.
Çünki bu Xitay hökuməti qattiq rast gap qılğan adam naq meydanda qolğa ilinadi dedi.
Because they knew if you speak the truth to the Chinese government, you'll end up in jail.
Şu vaxtdan tatib mən çoxum bu xalqni qutuldırış qararına gəldim.
Then I realized I had to speak out and help my people.
Mən 13 yaş vaxtımda sürgün qılınğan.
And as a child, as a 13-year-old child, my entire family was banished by the Chinese government.
Ailəm bilən veyrançılıq tatqan.
So our whole family suffered tremendously under Chinese rule.
Nimişki şundaq sürgün qıvat qılını ailəmmi, mənmi bilməymi?
And as a little kid, I didn't understand why we were banished by the government.
Şunda bolsunmu Xitay bilən ittifaq ötüp bir tərəf qilishdi qararda tuğan.
In spite of the suffering as a child and later grew up, and I thought I could work within the system and change that.
Şunu bilən mening ediyəm özgürüp getdi.
Then at that time, at that moment, everything changed in me.
Sarah?
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us today. My name's Sarah Holloway. I'm also on the National Board of Amnesty. When I hear your courageous and inspiring story, I feel like such a fraud because it's so easy for me to take human rights action and to do so knowing that I'm safe. What I can't wrap my head around is the courage that it takes for people in your position to take that action at home. And I was wondering how you manage to keep your hope up and keep, I guess, your faith that things will one day get better and that the fight is all worth it.
Mening ismim Sarah deydi. Men bu Amnesty Australia Amnesty'nin ayet əzası deydi. Ben hem de özlemge qarsam, sizin sözlerinizden ayrı təsirlendim, cesaretinizden hem de özlem qarsam böyle bir xəttər dövlətdə bunu deyiş asan deydi. Ama siz hem de qanday qılıb deydi, ümidinizni bu işdə axırki hesabda işler özgürlüğü yaxşı buldu deb müştölegen bedel güçlük. Yoki aynda ümid bilen qanday yaşaysınız? Qayerdan keldi bu ümitler deydi?
Ümid sizlerden keldi deydi.
My hope really comes from people like yourselves.
Çünkü bu dünyanın təqdirini özgərtiş doğruluq kürəş qıvatqa adamlar az emas.
Because there are many who are like us who want to change things.
Mən şunun birisi.
I am one of them. Thank you.
Ben, just down here.
Hi there, Ben Shockman. I'm not on the board of Amnesty. Thank you very much for the privilege to hear your words today. Following a little bit on from the last question, I was wondering what role, if any, human rights actually played in the hope, whether it was a knowledge or understanding of human rights, the framework itself, if it was at all relevant to your position. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, would you mind to rephrase it? So clear.
I mean, I guess your last answer was around knowing that there were people in the rest of the world and the solidarity that perhaps came with that. I was wondering what the concept of the idea of human rights itself, if that played any role in providing, I mean, was it even conscious to your thought, or was the framework in any way useful to continuing your struggle?
Okay. I get it.
I don't know whether I actually even rephrase that.
Okay. I think you said the exact same thing. Anyway, I got this the second time. Şu deydi, mənim Amnesty'nin board'un əzası emas deydi. Aldımdan deydi. Anikin deydi, hem de sizden abaytında ötüp gettiniz deydi bu. Sizden ümidiniz mi şu Şu kişilik hukuk üçün dünyada kurash qilgan adamlardan shular qarab ilhomlanib qilyapsiz deydi. Endi bunda qilayotgan chog'da sizni ashim shu kishilik huquq ilaqi ideyasida shuningda deydi. Uning bir cho'ng roli bormi? Ya'ni shu kishilik huquq ne o'tirib qo'yib shuni ishtirish orqali deydi, tashabbus qilish orqali shu orqali Uyg'urlarga bir umid aklishni, yani umid qilyapsiz deydi.
Albatta siz Amnesty'nin board a'zosi bo'lmagingiz bilan shuni qo'llaganlarning hammasi kishilik huquq ko'ngil bo'lgan har bir odam Amnesty deb o'zini o'ylab bo'laverdi deydi.
Yes, I certainly believe that to have this framework, as you stated, or concept of human rights, that helps a lot in framing our struggle as not just the persecuted minority, but rather as a human rights campaign for the rights of the Uyghurs. Although you are not a member of the Amnesty International board, but people like you who fight for human rights and should be included as part of the Amnesty International. So you are on the right track, doing the right thing. So.
Endi mush kishilik huquqni ishtirish, masalan mush Jungodagi Xitoy xalqimi mush kishilik huquq masalasi to'g'riliq burun bu to'g'riliq hukm yo'qdi Jungoning ichida deydi.
Yes, like even in China, the concept of human rights, the framework to pursue that, even in China, is something new. It's not very old concept for the Chinese people themselves to push, demand those rights from the government.
Ülüvassımı, kırılıvassımı, şunda harlansımı, muşnuq men bu şey haqliq o'xshaydi, siyosat shunda bo'lsa, bu ulug' ish, oshining o'zi ulug' deb qaraydi.
In the past, whether the Chinese people were persecuted by the Chinese government, in the past it was like they were sacrificing for a greater cause in China, but not so much their rights, human rights were violated.
Bizning bastırılışımızda haqliq deb qaraydi.
And they believe in good old days, their suffering was good,
Hazır mushu kishilik huquqni ishtirish Xitoy xalqining ichiga umumlashgandan mush Falun Gonglar deyli, Xitoy kishilik huquqi arboblari deyli, nurg'un tashkilotlar, masalan Tiananmen vaqasi, mushlar hammasi mushu kishilik huquq deganning ishtirilganligidan xalqning ingiga mushundaq bir narsani akilib, o'zi uchun kurash qiladigan narsaga yetakladi.
So the concept of human rights has been strengthened in China, whether among the Falun Gong or Chinese dissidents or Democrats, if you will, among us and others, and especially right before the Tiananmen massacre, and after that, it became a very popular thing in China now to fight for human rights, to pursue their own rights as human beings.
Hiç bo'lmaganda mening xalqim aeroplan bilan tikuchar bilan kishilik huquq akitibdi desa, mushuning bir mavjudligini bildi.
Like the Uyghurs also learned so much about human rights from Amnesty's miraculous rescue operation of me from the prison. So that the concept is really strengthened among all of the peoples under Chinese rule. So it's important for people whose rights were violated, know their rights and demand those rights.
It's all right, Ben, we'll let you into Amnesty.
On the board?
He's got to do that first.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yep. We can get a microphone to the middle. Thank you.
My name is Ben. I'm a student from New Zealand. My question is that have you ever worried that the more activism you do for the plight of the Uyghur people will have the reverse of the intended effect and lead to greater repression of the Uyghur people by the Chinese Communist Party? And if so, how do you reconcile yourself with this dilemma?
Mening ismim Ben deydi, Yangi Zelandiyadan keldim deydi. Endi mening so'raydigan savolim bo'lsa, siz qanchalik mushuna aktiv bo'lgan sari, endi buning ta'siri aksish bo'lib qilish mumkinmi Xitoyga deydi. Xitoy qo'pib siz qancha aktiv bo'lgan sari Uyg'urlarga shuncha qattiq ziyonkashlik qilish mumkinmi? Siz qanday qaraysiz bu masalaga dedi.
Ya undaq emas, u ziyonkashlik baribir o'xshashli shundaq qilib kelyapti.
I don't see it that way because the persecution had always been there long before me, my activism.
Masalan, shu 7-oyning 5-idagi vaqada Uyg'urlarni butunlay Rebiya qo'zg'ab, shundaq namoyish ochib, shundaq o'lishini keltirib chiqadi deb e'lon qildi.
One example is on the July 5th massacre of 2009 was completely blamed on me. China said I instigate all this bloodshed and everything.
Burun bo'lsa, shuning bütün muxbirlar berib, men ash dunyoga to'g'liganligim uchun, mening atrofimdagi dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiy sizlarga uqtuganliginglar uchun texi 10 мыңлап адам yo'qolgan bo'lsa, 100 мыңлап yo'qolishning oldi elindi.
But in fact, it's my belief that because I raised our voice and those people who worked with me raised our voice loudly in the world. So China was actually more careful during and after the massacre. If we did not raise our voice, the situation could have been much worse.
Mesela 57 yılı 61 ming adamni Qozaq, Qirg'iz, Uyg'ur, Tatar bo'lib 60 Mongol 5 millatdan biz bilan 61 ming adamni olib ketib birisini qaytib kelmagan.
And another example is in 1957, the Chinese government rounded up 61,000 Uyghurs, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Tatars, and Mongols who were not happy with Chinese rule. And almost all of them disappeared.
Yani hozirgidek vaqtda undaq akt g'oyib bo'lib ketsa, dunyo igi chiqadi, Amnesty igi chiqadi, boshqa ishlarlar g'arb dunyosi igi chiqadi, chunki buni bildirish kerak ekan.
So now it is hard for the Chinese government to get rid of so many people just so quietly, precisely because of organizations like Amnesty International raising it, people like me raising it. So China does its dirty work, but more careful.
Hech bo'lmaganda igi chiqadi.
So the international concern is very important.
Endi mening ovozim bilan uning ishi pasayib ketmaydi.
Certainly, the more I raise doesn't mean the situation will get much better, but we have to raise.
Şunu Xitoy hukumatı eng cho'ng tirishchanlik bilan meni yo'qotmoqchi.
So that's why China is targeting me so badly in order to destroy me.
Xitoy hukumatining ko'zidan ikki odam yo'qolish kerak bu dunyoda.
In the sight of the Chinese government, two people should disappear.
Birisi olmos Dalai Lama, birisi men.
Dalai Lama and man. Me. So, yes.
There's a bit of a competition to get to you.
I'm Ravi from University of Sydney. I want to ask that is the Chinese mainland people, not in China but outside China, like in America or other countries like Australia, come out and support Uyghurs or rights of Uyghurs?
Менің исмим Рави дейді, Сидней университетінің оқушысымын дейді. O'sha Xitoy cho'ng quruqlik emas, o'sha Amerikadagi chatga chiqqan Xitoylar endi Uyg'urlar masalasini qo'llamdi, yordam qiladi dedi.
Qo'llaydi, yordam qiladi. Biz bilan birlikda Uyg'ur masalasini dunyoga anglitdi, Uyg'urlarni qattiq bostirganlarda statement e'lon qilib Xitoyga qattiq norozilik bildirdi. Ham biz birlikda hamkorlashib ishlaymiz.
Yes, in fact, the Chinese people, especially Chinese Democrats overseas, they are our strong allies and supporters. They frequently raise their concerns over our situation and issue statements of concern and condemning the Chinese government's terrible abuse of the Uyghurs' human rights, and we work them very closely.
Anybody else have any questions? Just go here.
Hi there, my name's Michelle Tierney-Elliott. I'm a member of Amnesty. My question to you is, and as I listen to you, I thank you for your story and the struggle that you journey for your people. My question is, as I listen to you, where do your people still get to sing their songs, to speak their language and to do those processes? Is that an underground process, and is it something that's not being lost? Thank you.
Yes. Mening ismim Michelle, endi men Amnesty International a'zosi dedi. Abay so'zingizni anglab, hamda Uyg'urlarning tili, madaniyati yo'qligini anglab dedi. Lekin hozir hamda Uyg'urlar hamda o'zining naqshini nada aytadi, tilni qanday qo'g'daydi, qanday so'zlab, yer ostida maxfiy qilamdi, yo yana qila olamiz, naqshisini aytib, so'zni qila olamdi dedi.
Hozir Xitoy hukumati Uyg'urcha tekst bilan aytiladigan naqshlarni Xitoy tekst bilan aytishga majburlaydi.
And one thing what the Chinese government doing is changing the basically text of the songs from Uyghur into Chinese, forcing the Uyghurs to sing for the same tune in Chinese.
And musiqalarimizning hammasini bizning musiqa deb dunyoga e'lon qilyapti.
And the Chinese government also stealing our music and songs, claiming they are Chinese songs and musical instruments.
Oscar olgan kinoda muftilla ishlatgan bizning
Yeah.
musiqani.
Yes, if you see that Oscar-winning movie, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Crouching Tiger, all the music, all the songs are Uyghur inside. Yeah.
Lekin uni o'zining deb e'lon
This
qildi.
one young guy who was singing again for a Manchu girl or something like that. Young guy was supposed to be a Uyghur guy, and the desert was completely our Taklamakan desert. The songs, tunes were all Uyghur, and they won Oscar. No Uyghur is mentioned.
Endi bizning huquqimiz bo'lmagan uni bizning dalamaymiz biz hozir.
Since we're not a state, we cannot claim, heritage to those things, and it's stolen and divided up by others.
Addisi bizning tamaqlarımızın turuna aytacak. Uyghur tamaqlarının Xitayda danqı var.
And even our food, for example, Uyghur food is very popular among the Han Chinese. They love our food.
Hazır onun hemini bizning medeniyetimizde hep dünya elan kılar.
And Uyghur foods are eventually becoming Chinese foods, they call it.
Bizde onu deydiğen hukuk yok. Endi biz muş sırtqı şirketke Uygurlar, aşa özümüz medeniyet merkezlerini kurup özümüzдің tilimizni, özümüzдің medeniyetimizni aşı arkalı qoğdap qavatımız.
So only the Uyghurs outside of our country, we are able to kind of create, establish cultural centers, language teaching centers, to preserve our language and culture as much as we
Otur
could.
Asya'da, Kazakistan'da 2 milyondaki Uygur halkı var.
And luckily we have some 2 million Uyghurs living in Central Asian states of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. So they can preserve as well. Yes.
What is the, excuse my voice, but I've got a sore throat. What's the current population of the Uyghur people?
Uyg'urlarning nüfusu qanchalik hozir?
Biz 20 milyon halk. Xitoy hukumati 10 million deb e'lon qildi.
We believe we are up to 20 million people, but the Chinese government tried to dilute us, make us small like 10.
Hozirgi Jungo'ninki 6dan 1 qismi bizning ziminimiz.
But the size of our homeland is 1/6 of today's China. It's a very huge chunk of land.
We have just time for one last question. Robert in the back.
Robin Seth Purdy. What actions by human rights activists do you think would be most effective in changing the policy of the Chinese government?
Sizningcha deydi, qaysi bir usullar yoki vositalar mush Xitoy hukumatining kishilik huquq masalasiga mush animisni siyosatlarini o'zgartirishga foydali dedi.
Xitoyning ichidagi Xitoy xalqini uyg'otgan vaqtida ash Xitoy xalqi ashni tonib yetib birlikka kelib o'zi uyg'onib o'zi harakatga kelsa andin o'zgartirishga bo'ladi.
The most critical thing is really to wake up the Chinese people and support their pursuit for human rights. Then, when the Chinese people are fully aware of their rights to make the legitimate demands, then that can make great changes in China.
Andin sirtki mushunda kishilik huquqqa munosabatli odamlar ko'plab Jungo'ning ishiga va Sharq Turkistonga, Tibet ko'plab berib, ashlarning yerlik ahvolini egallab, Xitoy xalqini ashunda yetaklasa, ashuningda Xitoy xalqi o'zining taqdiriga o'zi uyg'onsa andikin bo'ladi.
It's also very important for human rights activists such as yours to visit our homeland, Tibet, China, and to really understand the human rights abuses, then expose them, and also lead the Chinese people in their pursuit. And that this will have positive effects.
Mening hozir his qilishimcha Xitoy hukumati o'zining xalqini qurol bilan tutib turyapti.
And my gut feeling is that the Chinese government is using the gun, pointing their own people to be silent.
Allaqachon Xitoy xalqi uyg'onib bo'ldi.
And I believe the Chinese people are already waking up.
Ularning kishilik huquqi shundaq muhtoj hozir.
And they need human rights as much as we do.
So, thank you very much. And we just have a small gift. And a lot of
Okay.
Thank you.